There we go. All right, so Genesis, week 1, Genesis chapter 1 and 2. What did we talk about? Creation, yes. Anything, what did we learn about God in creation? So this is a class where we're looking at the character of God in his story, in the story of Genesis, our creation story, and then the story of the patriarchs of our faith.
He made everything.
Yes, he's a creator, and what he makes is good. Yes, and that includes you, and that includes me. His creation is good. He's a creator. Yes. What did we talk about last week?
Okay, God means what he says.
Yeah. What was the overarching stories that we covered last week? Cain and Abel, yep. Cain and Abel and the fall or the choice of humankind to choose mortality over choosing divinity and life in Christ. And that's what we see, that choice is still set before us today, right? We see that in the Old Testament. We see that in the New Testament. We love when Moses is about to take the children of Israel into the promised land, and he says, choose for you this day. I set before you life, and I set before you death. Which will you choose? Will you choose your own way in disobedience and selfishness, or will you choose the way and the law of God? And that choice is still before each one of us every single day, isn't it? Yeah, it carries forward today. I mean, that would be a great thing to put on our mirrors, wouldn't it? Today, choose life, the way of Christ, the call of Christ, even if life means sacrifice. Choose life, or do we choose death? Do we choose the way of our human flesh, the way of selfishness, the way that builds my own kingdom and not his kingdom? So that choice is before us every single day. And Christ has come to show us the heart of the Father and to show us what it looks like and what it means to live a life that he has called us to, the life to the fullest, the way that Christ, the way of his kingdom and not the kingdom of mankind. So we talked about creation, and we talked about sin, and we talked about the first death, right? The first murder of Cain and Abel. And today we are going to be looking at Genesis chapters 5 through 9. We are not going to read them. There's way too much to cover. But we're going to talk about some high-level concepts in here. So if you didn't read it, that's fine. I'll talk through some different points, but I would encourage you afterwards to go back and allow the Lord to speak to you in it as he reveals himself, as he reveals his character. That's really what we're doing here. We're not just going through Genesis so that we know how to quote Genesis or that we have better theology on things. We are mining through these books so that we would know the heart of the Father. Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so as we look through the Old Testament, we say, Jesus, where are you? Show us the heart of the Father. And that's what he desires to do, and that's what he does. And so those are the questions that we ask on kind of a high level. So I'm going to pray, and then we'll jump right into Genesis. And for any of you guys who are new, this is like a very discussion-based class. So if you have any thoughts, any questions, any examples, feel free to jump in at any point in the class. There's goodies in the back. Feel free to grab one of those, coffee outside. But we really want to ask the Lord to come and to speak to us today. So let's go ahead. Let's start with prayer, and let's do that. Oh, Jesus, we thank you that you have made yourself known, that you continue to reveal yourself to us through your word and through the moving and the guiding and the speaking of your Spirit. And we ask that tonight you would do that again as we dive into the book of Genesis. Lord, would you reveal your Father heart? Would you help us to know you better, to understand you, to seek after you, and to love you with our body, soul, mind, and strength. And in doing so, to love our neighbor as ourselves. So we just thank you for this time, Lord. May this be a fruitful time, that you let our roots grow deep, that you would strengthen us, that you would encourage us, that you would challenge us, Lord, that you would shape us and even prune us, that we might be the kind of vessels and instruments that would further on your kingdom and bring glory to your name. So we just give you this time and ask all of this in the precious and lovely name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. All right. So we are in, where did my glasses go? Okay, there. All right. So did any of you guys read? Did you read any of these chapters?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Any first impressions as you read through some of these chapters?
Lots of names.
Lots of names. Yep.
Lots of names.
That's right. We see that often in different areas of the Bible. What else?
I'm blown away about how old he lived.
Yes.
That was good.
Yes.
I think they calculate. It just illustrates that God chooses people because Noah is chosen.
Yes.
And the animals that are on the ark, Noah doesn't go and seek them out. God says he'll send them to Noah.
Yes.
So God's choosing the animals and God chooses Noah, so God's choosing all the people that are pure and.
Yes. That is really, really insightful. That's really great. That's actually one of the points we're going to be talking about today. That's really
Everyone
good.
else is corrupt.
Yeah.
So he's gonna choose the uncorrupt animals. I'm not sure how that
Mm.
works.
Yeah, the clean and unclean.
The clean and unclean though.
Yeah, which is interesting, right? Because when do
Yes.
clean and unclean animals get set into play?
Yeah,
Not until the law.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so that's where you can see that this is being written through a perspective and through a language of somebody who's looking backward. That's why they say, a lot of people believe that Moses could have written the book of Genesis, but Moses would have been writing Genesis saying clean and unclean animals because he's writing through this new perspective and this new understanding of how God has revealed himself. And so when Moses goes back, he's explaining, he's writing this down to the Jewish people so that they would know that there's clean and unclean animals, not just all animals. So he's actually interpreting the past through the lens and the revelation that God has given him at that time. I'm reading a book called The Antiquity of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. I don't know if any of you heard of it, but he is a tremendous historian, one of the greatest historians of the first century. He wrote all about the Roman Empire and all this kind of stuff, but he was a Pharisee and he knows the Jewish culture really well. And I love at the beginning of his book, so he's writing to a Greek people. And so as he tells the story, he goes through the story of Genesis, Exodus, and the explanation of who the Jewish people were. He's trying to explain them, who these Jewish people are, what is the antiquity of their Jewish religion. And he's trying to say this to them and explain this. And he writes it all down in his book called The Antiquity of the Jews. So he wants the Greeks and the Romans to understand the rich culture and heritage of the Jews. And so in his book, he's always saying, and the Jews went to this place, to you now, that place is, and he'll say what the modern day names are. And I loved that because I thought he's taking something that is old and he could say, oh, the Jews were from Palestine. Well, they might not have known where Palestine was in their age. And so he says, but to you, this is this. And as he talks about Genesis, he talks about the different rivers that are written in here, that are written in Genesis 1 and 2. And he'll say, but those today are the rivers of X, Y, and Z. And so he tries to bring them in and say, do you understand that we're still living and gleaning off of one another's history? Yeah, it's really cool. But yes, that was a good thing to pick up, right? The clean and unclean animals. So there's a couple passages in the Bible. Did you raise your hand? Yeah.
Didn't God create all the animals?
Yes.
Well, why would he create an unclean animal?
Yes. So during
What makes an animal unclean?
Yes. So what we had talked about in like some of the first weeks is everything that God created was good. And then in the subsequent weeks, as we talk through Abraham and God begins to set a people apart for himself, what he will do is he will set a way of life about for himself and for these people that they would be known and they would be different than the people who are around him. So when we start talking about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, that's what the Lord did with Abraham, which we're going to start on Abraham next week. And so all the animals God created are good, which actually, when we fast forward now to the New Testament, doesn't Peter say that as well? He says, there's nothing clean or unclean anymore. Not Jew nor Gentile. There's no division of it anymore. But back in the time of Abraham, and when we look at this from a 40,000 viewpoint, not from literalness, which is literal, but not from the as much of the literalness as what is God trying to say to the people or to us? What is God trying to do by setting people aside, by setting aside clean and unclean animals? He's trying to distinguish them from the people groups that are around them. He's trying to set himself apart as Yahweh, to say, I am different than the world around you. I am different than the gods around you. And so by obeying certain law, Jewish law, it would become Jewish law, it was the Hebraic law at the time. By obeying it, you identified with a people group and a way of life that you knew pleased your God. So he was setting aside a people to honor him, to love him, to be for himself. And isn't this what God still does today with the power of his Spirit? He says, you are my children now. So what he said with Abraham and the Hebrew people, you are my children, you are my chosen ones. He still does today through the power of the Spirit with Jesus. When we surrender our lives to Jesus and we receive that impartation of the Spirit, he says, you are my children. You belong to me. And then we have a call of Christ. And that's what we are talking about even in this class. What is the call of Christ in our lives? And that's very much the writings of Paul. That's why Paul had written to the church. So yes, so at this point in history, if we're looking at this from a timeline standpoint of Genesis, and during the time of Noah, there's nothing clean and unclean. God has not made that distinction yet. But a lot of religious scholars believe that Moses wrote the books of the Pentateuch, the Torah, basically, and Moses wrote the book of Genesis, and Moses was living under the Jewish law at the time. And so Moses, looking back, would say, oh, wow, he brought clean and unclean animals. Noah would not have necessarily distinguished them himself as clean and unclean animals, unless the Lord revealed that to him, and we just don't know, right? There might be uncertain things.
But Noah,
Did that answer your question a little bit? A roundabout way? Yes.
but God knew that Noah was gonna be different,
Mm-hmm.
because in what I read, I don't know what version of the Bible I have, but it says, this one will comfort us concerning our work and the toil of our hands. So it's almost like, you know, he said about Jesus,
Yeah.
this one will come and save us. So he's saying about Noah, this one will comfort us.
Yes. And you'll see that all over the Old Testament. They're called types of Christ. And so Abraham is a type of Christ. Adam is a type of Christ. That's why Jesus was called the second Adam. You see all sorts of types. They're kind of like a parallel. You see the parallel in them. Yes. So Noah, this idea, like a lot of people think the baptism in the ark in the floodwaters is like the baptism that we walk through. You know, they'll say, oh, the ark is like a type of baptism. You know, it's symbolic. It's a symbolic thing. Yeah, that mirrors one another. But yeah, so in Genesis, remember these first chapters 1 through 11, it is that Hebraic poetry. So we're reading these poetic tales of the beginning of time and how we are to see the character and the heart of God, who he is and who we are in him. And so we begin to see some very strange stories. What seems strange to us, I don't think it was probably strange to people back then, but as we lead up to the Noah story, there is this unique story in chapter 6 about the wickedness of men. And, you know, I don't know if you guys had read that, where it says, when human beings began to increase in numbers, so this is Genesis chapter 6, on the earth, the daughters were born to them, and the sons of God saw that these daughters were beautiful. They married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with human beings forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, and this is when the sons of God went to the daughters of human and began to have children with them. They were the heroes of old and men of renown. the Lord saw how great this wickedness of the human race had become on earth, and every inclination of every thought of the human heart was evil. And the Lord had regretted that he made human beings on the earth, and it deeply troubled him. And this is when he decides now that he's going to wipe creation from the earth. I remember being a kid reading this. I was like, the sons of God mated with the daughters of human beings, and they created these giants. So I did all this like study on the Nephilim. There's all sorts of apocalyptic texts and stuff like that that you can read, and you can do a deep dive on this kind of stuff. But when we come to passages like this, what's the question we ask? What are we asking through the book of Genesis? Why is this in here? Why did Moses, why is this in here? Why would this be in here? Why is it important to know? Lord, what are you showing me about your character through this story? And so I just had a couple thoughts, and anything you guys have, any thoughts you have on this would be great as well. So I asked, why is this in here? And there are just a couple things that I wanted to highlight here. The preservation of God's order and purpose of creation. Do you remember in the first one, we talked about how God creates in order and God creates on purpose, and God creates distinction, male and female. God creates humans and creation and plants and animals and things of the sky and things of the sea. God creates distinction. He separates and he creates these different things. And what's happening, and Prager, who, the commentary that I had shown you earlier on, he talks about, this whole idea of mixing the human and divine, and how it really is not God's order. When God creates things on purpose, he doesn't need them to be mixed. Mixing of human and divine, what does that remind you of? What's that?
The Greeks.
The Greeks? Yes. Oh, very much later on. Yes, in history. Doesn't it remind you of Eve? What does the serpent say to her? If she eats of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, you will be like God. And what does she do? That sounds really nice. I want to be like God. And I wonder if part of this passage isn't in here, because you'll end up seeing later on at the Tower of Babel, they built something so high that they could be like God. And this whole idea of human beings trying to be God, trying to be like God, God is saying, no, that's not the distinction I have for you. Come on in, Hannah. That's not the purpose that we have for one another. There is God and there is human. Don't confuse your position in this world. Let God be God, and let us walk in the ways and the plans that he has created. It is not good for us to try to be God. It is not good for us to make that decision. It shows that lack of identity. I think God was really disappointed in this. He said, no, I've given you an identity. I've given you an identity as sons and daughters that I walk with, and you have changed that. And so God is protecting his creation in this. He's very upset. And that's why he decides to wipe out the world. I also believe that this is partially in here to show us the repercussions of sin.
Because I saw selfishness.
Yes.
My Bible said they took wives for themselves. So by taking something, that means that you don't necessarily have the permission of the other person.
Yeah, that's really good. Absolutely. I mean, can you imagine how wicked the world must have been? That every thought and every inclination, I don't know if any of you, I love history, so I read a lot of history. History is utterly depressing to read. It really is. I mean, when you start seeing the depravity of humanity and how, I mean, you read about the South American slave trades. Oh my gosh. I mean, it is just, you cannot even believe, it is just horrible what human beings do to one another. And this here says every inclination of every thought was evil. It's horrible, right? And just the utter depravity. And so we see the multiplication of sin here. There are giants in the land. Now, there are actually giants in the land all the way through David. We read about that, right? David kills Goliath. Yes. So there are giants in the land, and a lot of people believe that this is the giants. A lot of historians and scholars believe that the giants are a result of this. They're a result of a disorder, of the distorting order. And as I was thinking about that, you can argue proof or not on that kind of stuff, but that's not what we're going to do here. I was just looking at it and I think sin really does multiply. Sin grows and sin distorts. God's creation is really, yeah,
I'm so behind, so I wasn't here last week.
that's okay.
Are we talking about the angels having
Mhm.
sex with people?
Yeah.
Did you read the book of Enoch?
Yes.
Okay, I asked Pastor Brian if he did.
Yeah.
He was like, yeah, I think she did that.
Oh, yeah. It's 3 books, actually, but you can buy it as one book. Yeah. Enoch 1, 2, and 3. It's an apocalyptic book, which is not considered a canonized text.
I
know,
just thought it was interesting because it references
Yes.
this,
The flood as well.
It references this stuff, so
Yes.
it's interesting.
What's the name?
What?
What's the name?
Oh, the book of Enoch. It's like
Enoch.
Enoch, like like they have the book of Maccabees and
Yes.
I don't know if anyone knows what I'm talking about.
Yes.
But, I asked for the book of Enoch for Christmas last year from my dad, so he got me the one that
Yes, it's very
likes,
bizarre.
that has- Yeah,
Yeah.
but it kept my attention because
Yes.
it had at the beginning of it has a lot of this, like it
Mhm.
even names specific angels. And
Yes.
it's like this angel did this, and I was like, oh
Yes.
my gosh, it's putting like a name to this wickedness.
Yes.
I don't know.
It reads a lot like the book of Revelations. It's considered an
Yes,
apocalyptic text.
yes.
Yes, very symbolic, very apocalyptic in its nature. It reads kind of like Daniel a little
Yeah.
bit.
It
yes.
is hard.
It actually was it was canonized in the Ethiopian Bible, but it was not canonized in the Western Bible.
So were these angels like the cast out angels or fallen angels?
Yeah, could have been.
In my book here, it says, my Bible, the one, it says some people have thought that sons of God were fallen angels, but the sons of God were probably not angels, because angels do not marry or reproduce.
Yeah. So we don't really know. This is where we can do deep dives, right? And we can read, and there's all sorts of brilliant people who have written on this. And we could get lost again in the weeds. And that's why we're going to take a step up and we're going to say, is there something the Lord can speak to me about his character, about human nature, about my nature in this text? In here. This is in here for a reason. It's ancient Hebraic poetry. So why would they keep this in here? Possibly to show us the repercussions of sin that keep going. Sin keeps going, and it distorts and it multiplies and it becomes the giant in the land. So that's just kind of a side note in there. The book of Enoch, yes.
Who is God talking to? I mean,
Mhm.
what's the name of the guy that did the Rational Bible?
Oh, Dennis Prager?
Right, and he talks about how God went through 3 steps to eventually bring us around. And at the beginning, he
Yes.
gave us the conscience, and that's where we are now, is that people have their conscience and they are not listening to it. But at that time, like God spoke to Noah,
Mm-hmm.
who was he talking to other than Noah? And how did he choose who he was gonna talk to? And one of the states we're in now in our culture, or in the world culture, is we're not following biblical, which is bringing about, the modern world is reverting back to.
Mm-hmm.
So who is he talking to?
Yeah, so there are a lot of holes. Remember, we talked about how we're not going to get all the things answered. Maybe there were other people God was talking to that didn't respond. We don't know, right? But we know, what we do know is he saw Moses.
Right.
And he spoke to Moses.
Right, but
Yeah.
until then,
Yes.
yeah, I mean.
Yeah,
was
and he walked with men. We know that he walked with Cain and Abel, right? He walked with Enoch, and Enoch was no more.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, right? Right?
Okay.
Take me away.
Yeah, so there are some things we know, there's a lot we don't know.
Right.
And it's okay to say, listen, I don't know the ancient history of all the world, but this is what I know. God walks with his creation. He did from the beginning, and he still does today.
Right.
That's what I know. that's what I know. And that's what I can bank my life on, that God is here. His presence is enough. His presence is with me.
Well, I know, but that's such a gift that,
Yeah.
that they didn't have back then, that they didn't have in any of the Old Testament, other than his presence to certain people, but, until the Holy Spirit came, and you've got,
Yeah.
and, so I can see why they.
Alpha does a really good teaching. I don't know if any of you guys took the Alpha course, but they do a really good teaching on the Holy Spirit. They do 3 courses on, what was life like before the Holy Spirit, and they do some teaching through that, and there's all sorts of thoughts, and we could spend all day debating all sorts of stuff. But yeah, it's good to ask the questions and do some digging, but it's also good to come back and say, the purpose of this is that we would know the Lord more. The purpose of this is that we would hear his voice, that we would understand him, that we would allow him to change us and convict us and lead us on and spur us on in the faith. And so that's very good. I would also in here, let me see here. Okay, so Genesis 5, it kind of reiterates this Hebraic poetry of how humans are created in the image of God. Don't you love how God keeps repeating that in his scripture? Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3, Genesis 5 here. Again, he says, and you're created in my image. So that's reiterated here in Genesis 5, Genesis 6. Then humans aren't satisfied and they want to be like gods. And we see the repercussions of that through this story, which it's in here because then it leads up to the flood story of the Lord saying, I need to start over. And then I love Genesis 6, verses 9 through 22. But then there was Noah, and he did everything God commanded. I mean, wouldn't that be great on your headstone someday? Like, here lies Becca, and she did everything the Lord asked. I mean, to say that, like, that's a testimony. And you'll see that over and over again. God said, and so Noah did. God said, and so Noah did. I just love that. And so then we enter this story of the ark, the ark and the flood, which nearly every single ancient society and faith, and not even just religions, but ancient society has a flood story. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? And they're all slightly different. Like even in Enoch, it's different. It talks about it flooded 1/3 of the earth and things like that, right? But there's flood stories, and there's this kind of consistent, strange thread throughout all sorts of cultures, which I think is really interesting. It'd be fun to do a study on that one day. But as I was looking at the Genesis story, or the flood story, and it really picks up kind of halfway through 6, and then it goes through God's covenant with Noah in 9. There are just 3 things I wanted to point out, and then we're going to do a little reading and some discussion. And as we ask, Lord, teach me about your character. Where are you in the story? As I read the Noah story, I see in the character of God that God always looks for the redeemable in us. Isn't that amazing? All of his creation was evil. All of the things that humans had sinned and distorted and disrupted and defiled, but God saw Noah. He still saw him. And I think, like, if this whole story is a picture of my life, there is so much corruption, so much selfishness in myself. But isn't it amazing that God sees the things that are redeemable in us?
So he walked with him.
Yeah.
So that reminds me of when God used to walk with Adam. So I wonder that has that sort of relationship.
Yeah, when we walk with the Lord and he sees us and he knows us. And he sees us and he loves us. We even said this on that first week, remember? Yet in our sin, he died for us. He still died for us, and he loves us. God always looks for the redeemable things in us. And he always can see, despite seeing the worst in us, he speaks to the redemptive purposes in our lives. And I think that this is something that we can learn to do in one another. I don't know if you've ever heard people say, speak to a child's purpose, not to their place. So what you see in them, their potential, I see this in you. I see that this gifting in you. You know, you have that firecracker of a child who never wants to sit still and listen. What is the purpose? Like what is something life-giving that you can speak to into that child's life and into that person's life, seeing the potential? And I think this is a real exercise that we could take on and say, Lord, help me see the potential in other people. You always see it in me. What is redeemable in this person's life? And how can I speak to that? How can I carry about your kingdom by speaking about that which is redeemable in this person's life? And in the Old and New Testament, we see this all over the place. Jesus always spoke to the potential in people, didn't he? I mean, you think of, and we won't get to the life of Moses because that's in Exodus, but like, none of the people God picked thought they were qualified to be picked. But he said, no, there's something I see in you. There's something I see in you. And he went around and he spoke life and potential and purpose and destiny into everybody's life that he met. He saw that potential. He purposely did. I mean, think of the life of Paul. You know, he was Saul and then he became Paul. I mean, Saul was a horrible person who was imprisoning and probably killing people of the way, the Christians. And God saw that fervor and that zeal in his life. He said, I can use that. And I'm going to use that. And he met him and he blinded him in his sin. And he said, I'm going to show you something else. And Paul changed his name from Saul to Paul, became the first missionary and the greatest evangelist. And we have the New Testament, most of the New Testament because of him. And you think, man, God saw the potential in people, didn't he? And that's something that we can still do. He even saw that in Peter after Peter denied him, didn't he? Yeah, he reinstated him. Yeah, and he said, Peter, I'm going to change your name from Simon to Peter. You're a rock. Peter's like, oh no, I'm somebody who's going to deny you. I'm wishy-washy. I'm afraid. And he's like, no, you're a rock. And what did Peter end up living up to? Being the foundation and the rock of the early church. And so speaking, God sees that redeemable in us. And I just love that. Isn't that so encouraging? The Lord is so good. He's so good in that. Secondly, as I read through this Noah story, I look at how God brings significance to our lives. He brings significance to our lives. You know, I often think, and we see this a lot, that the Lord gives us things that are good, and then the enemy wants to distort them, right? So God gives us, you know, sex and intimacy with a partner, and the enemy distorts that. God gives us friendship, and the enemy distorts it. God gives us love, and the enemy distorts it. And I think this significance that God speaks into our lives, the enemy tries to distort it into being fame. And Prager talks about this a lot in the commentary. There's a huge distinction between significance and fame. Very few people can become famous, right? So what does that cause in human nature? Jealousy, anger, competition, hate, backbiting, violence.
Arrogance.
Because we hunger to be significant, because God created us to be significant, but we can all be significant to each other, can't we? Its significance is how you serve and how you are viewed by other people as a blessing. Fame is very self-focused, and the enemy wants to distort that in our eyes. But it is good to remember that God created us to be significant to him and in the lives of other people as well. And we can all do that. And when we chase after the things of the world, we will always compromise. We will always compromise our integrity. And I'm not talking fame necessarily like Taylor Swift. I'm talking like, oh, I want to make a name for myself. So all of a sudden we compromise the way that we treat a fellow employee. Maybe we compromise the way that we file our taxes because we just want a little bit more money. Maybe we compromise on some of these areas, and all of a sudden we're looking for some sort of fame and accolades and to be someone in this world. And the Lord is like, no, I don't need you to be someone in the world. You are already significant. I just need you to bless somebody else. I need you to be obedient. I think of Jesus, how Jesus said that it was the little children, the lame, the poor, the sick, the outcast. Those were the people that Jesus went to. And he made them feel significant. He helped them. He made them to feel seen. He didn't need to create pomp and fame for himself. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Jesus rode in to Jerusalem on a donkey and not a horse. The kings rode on horses. Jesus didn't need to do that. He said, no, this isn't about me creating a name for myself. This is about me blessing and revealing the heart of God. Jesus says, when you pray, when you fast, when you give, when you go to a banquet, do and act like a servant. Don't act like somebody who's somebody. We all love being around that person, don't we? The somebody who's somebody. Don't you know who I am? Yeah. So I think it's really good to know and to search our hearts. I talk a lot about taking inventory. It was like that question that God asked Adam, like, where are you? Where are you, Becca? Are you seeking to build up your own name? Are you seeking your own fame? Or are you seeking kingdom significance? Are you seeking to make a difference in somebody else's life? Are you looking outward rather than trying to build up inward? Are you being others focused or self-focused? And I think that's a really good inventory question, Lord, because I think we can actually do good things sometimes and be good people, but we actually have the wrong motives. And I'm not saying it's bad to do good things, but I'm saying God really does care about our hearts. He cares about shaping us and the motives that drive us. And so I think it is really good to take that inventory. I remember actually one time, it was when I first started being a worship leader, and this was in Minnesota, and it was at a very large church, and it was, I don't know, one of the first Sundays that I had led, and I was singing this amazing song, and I'm singing, and my voice just cracks, right? And I mean, it was a big church. We're talking like a 3,000 person auditorium, I mean, it was big. And my voice cracked. And I remember after the worship set, I just went off stage and I was like, so embarrassed. I was so upset at myself. I was just distraught. I'm like, I can't even believe, I was just so embarrassed. I sounded terrible. My voice cracked. And I just remember the Lord being like, Becca, this isn't about you. By the way, your leading worship is to bless me. This is not about impressing people with your voice. Don't ever get those two things confused again. And I'll tell you what, that was one of the best lessons I ever learned, because I don't really care anymore, because we're worshiping Jesus. And so it's some of those gentle corrections that the Lord is like, you're kind of going in the wrong direction on this one. Let me re-steer you here. And then lastly, as we look at the story of Noah, and we'll break into our groups in a few minutes, one of the things that I see in this story is just how beautiful it is that God journeys with us in life every step of the way. Every step of the way. God journeyed with Noah in the building of the ark. Isn't that crazy? Like when you read some of these passages, when he's like, okay, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to destroy the world, and you need to build an ark. And then he starts telling him, this is how you're going to do it. The ark is going to be 300 cubits long, and the ark is going to be this, and 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits, and make room for it, and leave it open for this. And he goes on and on and on, all at the end of 6. And it's just like, God really lays out a plan for Noah, doesn't he?
What if he had used the wrong water, made it
What if?
not as long? Would he have?
There's actually a lot of like symbolism and type in the ark. Like the kind of wood, like cypress wood is considered like a holy, like all this. It's kind of cool if you ever want to do a study on the ark, and even the dimensions and the way that it looks and everything. But I thought, man, he journeyed with Noah. He told him, hey, this is what's going to happen. This is what you need to do, and this is how you need to do it. And I think sometimes that we think God speaks to us in general ways, like love your enemies. And he does say that, right? He says that. But God speaks specifically to, hey, Becca, that neighbor who's driving you crazy because they let their dog out that runs around in your yard and barks till 4 a.m, I want you to bring them a meal tomorrow and show them how much you love them. God's specific. He's specific. I think, so the first time I ever really felt the Lord speak to me in my heart, like I don't hear him in my ears, I hear him in my heart. The first time I ever heard him speak to me, I was a young professional, and I wasn't going to church. I was looking for a church at the time. So I was like going to a gazillion different churches, but we grew up like tithing, like you got to tithe, man. So I was like, oh man, I'm robbing God. I need to tithe somewhere. Where do I tithe? You know? And I remember I was walking through the second floor of a building that I was managing at the time. And I was like, Lord, what do you want me to do? Like, where am I supposed to tithe? And I ended up stopping. I felt the Lord speak to me so specifically. He gave me 2 people and different amounts. He said, you're supposed to give $300 a month to Rich. He's going on a missions trip and he needs that support. You're going to do that for 1 year. And then you're going to anonymously give $100 in a, what are those called? Cashier's checks or something, right? $100 a month to Tony's ministry. These 2 guys that I knew that were in ministry. And I'm not kidding you, I stopped. I remember I was at the top of an escalator and I was like, this is crazy. God just told me exactly what to do. So I went out once a month. I got a cashier's check and mailed it off anonymously to this guy, Tony. And I did that for a year. And then I called this missionary, Rich. And I knew he was doing like a year-long missions trip. And I just said, hey, you know, I don't know if you need any more support, but you know, the Lord wants me to support you. I want to support you $300 a month. He starts crying on the phone. He's like, do you know that I needed a supporter to come up forward this week to support me $300 a month? That was the last amount of money I need before they're going to approve this missions trip. And he was like, and the Lord told me that he was going to bring someone. He goes, and then you called. And I just was sitting here thinking, God is so specific. I could not believe how God is so specific. So I usually say this to people in the membership class. If you've never heard God speak to you, like really speak to you specifically, ask him how much to give. I'm serious. It was crazy. It like opened my spiritual ears to the Lord. And sometimes that's what these disciplines, you know, we talk about spiritual disciplines like fasting and praying and giving and meditating. Sometimes that's what these disciplines do. They unlock, they remove barriers that are blocking us from actually hearing from the Lord and having him work in amazing ways in our life. And so I love it. I love that the Lord journeyed with Noah as he built the ark. I mean, the ridicule, the hard work, the uncertainty. How long does it say that it took Noah to build the ark?
120 years.
120 years! Can you imagine getting these orders from the Lord?
It was like 900.
Oh my gosh. Getting these orders from the Lord, and it's like, wait a minute. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, this seems more, and what does it say? Noah did everything just as God commanded him. He didn't question, he didn't ask why. At this point, we don't even know if Noah has ever seen rain. And he says, all right, this is absolutely ridiculous what you're asking me to do, Lord. And I'm gonna do it. And I'm gonna do it. I just love that. And then God journeyed with Noah through the preparation. In Genesis 8, and you had alluded to this in chapter 7, verse 8. Pairs of clean and unclean animals, of birds, of all creatures that moved along the ground, male and female, came to Noah and entered the ark. Noah obeyed what God asked him to do, and God did the miraculous. Don't you wonder if Noah was like building this, like building out the horse stall, and he's like, where am I gonna find a horse? Building out like a rhino stall? How am I gonna get these animals in this boat? Like, what's gonna happen? But he obeyed, and then he saw the fruit of his obedience. Can you imagine what that looked like when the Lord began to bring animals to the ark and they began to file in? Whether this is literal or poetry, it's pretty tremendous. I believe it really happened, okay? But even still, can you imagine that miracle of seeing these animals walking in 2 by 2? Like the miraculous happening right in front of them? It's like that if you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
all this hard work. It was hard work. And here is Noah. He obeys. And it made me think this week as I was looking at this point, I wonder how many tremendous moments I've missed in my life because I didn't listen to the Lord's first command. How many times I've missed the 2x2 miracle. Because God said, Becca, I want you to bless that person. I want you to say this to that person. Go ask that person if they need prayer. And I said, no, I'm busy. I'm too busy. Becca, why don't you bless that person? They need some financial help right now. But Lord, I don't have that much money. We just had to pay for Hume, and it's crazy expensive. That's the trip that all of our kids are going on this weekend, and the prices keep doubling every year, if you didn't know. And I just wonder, you know, God gave Noah this almost what seemed probably at the time a ridiculous assignment. And if Noah would have been like, listen, I'm gonna half the size of this. This is a little unrealistic. We don't need this much space. It's just me and my kids. We don't need all this room for the animals. I don't need the window here, and I don't need the second floor. And Lord, let's be a little more realistic. And the Lord's like, will you just obey? And I'm gonna do something amazing in your life. Would you just trust me with the first thing I'm asking you to do? And you're going to see the miraculous fruit of the 2x2 walk right in front of your life. Yeah.
And then he shut them in.
Yeah.
He closed the
Yeah.
door. I was like,
Like,
what?
Yeah.
Noah got in
Yeah.
and he could not
Yeah.
get back out.
Yep.
He shut them.
Yeah. He protected them. Yeah, absolutely.
You know what stuck out to me in chapter 7, in verse 9, it says they came motivated by God.
Yes.
I mean, I love it.
Yes, isn't that awesome?
They came motivated.
Yes.
They motivated the animals to go in there, so it's just like.
But yet, in the beginning of chapter 7, he told him to take 7 of every clean animal and 2 of unclean.
Yeah.
He
Yes.
told him.
Yeah, so God gives specific instructions like we just talked about, but then God does the rest. God does the rest. If we obey step 1, God will take care of the subsequent steps in our lives. Isn't that amazing? I just thought, Lord, I don't ever want to miss the 2x2 miracle again. I want to be the person who will be bold enough to go up to somebody and give them a word of encouragement or pray for them or live sacrificially or do whatever he's called us to do. Look at how, just read a gospel and you'll be utterly convicted to a life of following after Christ because he calls us to do simple, difficult things every single day. And he does the rest. He brings the miracle.
They're called opportunities.
Opportunities. Yes. Yes.
I can't speak for anybody else, but when I think of opportunities, I don't
Yes.
think of that, but they are opportunities.
Yes. Yeah, they are. You know, I often say God's speaking all the time. We just need to be able to tune in to what he's saying. You know, at this church, we don't use the word like prophetic a whole lot. We use the word hearing God for others. And when we hear what the Lord wants to say, and he says, hey, go up, tell Hannah she's a great mom. Lord, that's ridiculous. Why would, she doesn't need to know that. Why does she need to know that today? And it's kind of like, Noah, you don't need to know why you need all the animal rooms. I'm going to do on the other side something amazing if you will just be obedient and step out. And that's what Noah did. I just loved it. And I just love how like all of these what seem almost ridiculous commands that the Lord is giving him, he just does. He says, Noah did it. And I just want to be that person. I just want to be that kind of person. And then God journeyed with Noah in the drifting. You know, it's funny, I actually heard a fantastic preacher who's very famous, and he talked about, 40 days in the ark, 40 days in the ark. Noah was in the ark 364 days, not 40. Noah was in the ark. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. He drifted for 150, and then he was stuck, motionless, locked inside the ark for about 170 plus days after that, before the land was dried.
That's right, the ark rested on the 7th month.
I remember the first time I realized that, you know, because we always learn about 40 days and 40 nights, you know, it rained. A year of mucking out stalls. A year of, you know, whatever it looks like, right? Like sometimes we can get into the real literal. But I think the Lord journeyed with him every step of the way. Can you imagine how violent those storms were? That they flooded the whole earth? It says the foundations of the earth broke open and water just poured up. I mean, it must have been torrent storms. But the Lord was with him. The Lord's with us in the storms of life. When we feel tossed and turned and we don't know which way is up and we're puking off the side of the boat all the time because we're so sick and tired of the weather, the Lord is with us. The Lord watched over him and he watched over Noah. And then the drifting, the rain stopped, it said, and the foundations of the earth closed up, and then Noah drifted 150 days of silence. There's not another person on the earth, and he's just drifting. Do you know that God told him what to do to build an ark? And he told him there would be a flood. He never told him how long he was going to be locked in that boat. But Noah went, and he stayed. I think sometimes life can bring us those seasons of drifting, can it? Where it's just like, get up and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. But you know, the Lord is with us in those days. The Lord's walking with us. He encourages us. He speaks to us. He can minister to us. He's preserving Noah and his creation in these days. So whether you're in a storm or whether you're drifting, or whether you're in a season where you just feel stuck, can you imagine that boat rested? And so Noah's like, all right, it's gotta be any day now. And it's like 170 more days of just sitting stuck on that boat. And it's like, Lord, I'm stuck. No, you're not stuck. I'm doing something in your life. You're not stuck. Lord, I just feel, I'm just so stuck. I'm so impatient. No. I'm preserving something in you right now. I am doing something. I am preparing something for you. You're just not ready to step out of the boat yet. But I'm doing something. You can trust me. The Lord was there with
I
him.
like the part about the dove, though.
Yeah, where he sends out, notice, what does he send out before the dove? Raven.
The dove comes back.
Yeah.
The dove comes back and he draws the dove into himself and sends the dove out again. I like that, draws it into himself.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
almost like the dove's telling him the secret. Like,
Mhm.
it's not telling him.
Sometimes when you're reading this, you know, it's not in our language, right? First of all, it's in a language of like, I don't know what, 5,000 years old. So it's a very ancient language of poetry. So we're translating through through the millennial, but then we're also translating the language. But you can almost still see and feel that poetry in there, right? The way that it explains things and the way that it talks about things. But yeah, I just want to leave you on that thought. You know, sometimes we may feel like we're either tossing in a storm or drifting aimlessly or stuck and standing still and in a season of waiting. But I just want you to know God is with you in every season. And you can trust that he's with you and he's going to speak to you in every season if we lend our ear to him, if we tune our voice to him. I love in Matthew 28:20, Jesus says, teach these commands. So he leaves all these commands to the new disciples, which is us also, by the way, the disciples. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands that I've given you. And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. We have a God who journeys with us, who walks with us, that we can trust in all of the seasons of life. So I'm going to release you guys now for the next 10 minutes. I want you to read Genesis 9, verses 8 through 17. Genesis 9, verses 8 through 17. So we're skipping over a little bit, and we're going to get to kind of a covenanting part. So Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17, and take the next few minutes and read it carefully, read it over again, and ask the Lord, is there anything that stands out to you? Is there anything a picture that comes to mind? Anything it makes you think of? Anything maybe that the Lord wants to minister of his character to you? Where is there anything in here that you see Jesus in? So let's just take the next 10 minutes and read through that, and let's write down anything that comes to mind over these next few minutes.